In this segment, we want to talk about the democratic peace theory, which is one of the most important findings over the last 40 years or so in the field of international politics, because there seems to be quite a bit of evidence for it. A lot of people believe it, and it's inspired a lot of foreign policy, especially U.S. foreign policy. What I want to focus on is separating out explanations for the democratic peace that might be right versus those that really can't be right, at least with the data that we currently observe. And let me explain. The empirical pattern that this entire finding is based on these big data sets of all international wars going back to 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And what we see is that democracies, depending on how you interpret a few cases, democracies either never go to war with each other or they almost never go to war with each other. But they go to war with other countries just as often as non-democracies. So it's not that democracies are less warlike, it's that they just don't fight with each other. And any explanation of the democratic peace has to be consistent with both of those patterns. In other words, there's two patterns. Democracies don't go to war with each other. They do go to war lots with others. And so any explanation has to explain or fit with both of those patterns, right? Why they don't fight each other, but why that doesn't keep them from fighting others. And some of the explanations we're going to see, and I'm going to show you a few in just a moment, really fit the first criterion, but not so much the second. And these, in fact, are some of the classic explanations. And so we need to be wary of these. So one is public opinion. And this is an argument that goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant in 1795, but also others more recently, who argue essentially that public opinion will always be against war because people suffer from war. And so the argument is that where people have power in democracies, they won't go to war because they suffer from it. The problem is that while that might explain why democracies wouldn't go to war with other democracies, you'd also expect them to go to war less overall. And again, the historical record, the data show that that's just not the case. They go to war plenty often with non-democracies. And of course, we know from some recent experience in the United States, right? Some of the wars that the United States has thrown, whether in Afghanistan, after the 9/11 attacks, or in Iraq a few years later, at least initially have been quite popular. A sort of similar argument really focuses more on autocracy, and the idea is that because autocratic states don't get their legitimacy from voters, they've got to get legitimacy from it some other way, and that those leaders will go to war as a way of building their popularity. But again, you have the same problem, which is that could be true, but if war comes from autocracy, then we would see democracies never going to war and never starting wars. But in fact, we see democracies going to war, and we see democracies starting wars, again, as our wars in Afghanistan or Iraq would demonstrate. The third argument is this argument about mutual respect between democracies, or what's sometimes called the normative explanation. That's what I call it in the textbook. And this is the idea that there is mutual respect between democracies. Democracies respect each other, and that keeps them from going to war. And what's interesting about that is that's an argument that's not a characteristic of a single democracy. It's a characteristic of a dyad, or a pair of democracies. So democracies, in this view, would still be expected to go to war with non-democracies because you wouldn't have that mutual respect between a democracy and a non-democracy. So this normative explanation at least potentially fits with the data that we see, because it doesn't expect democracies to go to war less overall. It really focuses on relations just between democracies. Similarly, there's this argument that combines an argument about democratic success in war with democratic sensitivity to defeat. And the argument here is twofold. It combines two things. One is democracies tend to win wars, and why that is true, there's a lot of speculation about. But if you, again, kind of look at the batting average of democracies in wars, democracies do pretty well. And the argument is Democrats are especially sensitive to losing wars because they can get voted out of office, right? Losing wars are really unpopular. So the argument is the combination where democracies tend to win and Democrats are especially sensitive to losing wars means that democracies or democratic leaders will be very hesitant to go to war with other democratic leaders because they have an increased chance of losing, and they know that's likely to them losing power. And the argument, again, is that obviously that doesn't hold for autocratic dyads, but it also doesn't hold for democratic autocratic dyads. So this explanation too seems plausible with a broad range of explanation, with the broad pattern of data rather that we see in the democratic piece. The key point that I want to make here is that these third and fourth arguments, I'm not saying that they are right. I'm saying that they're at least consistent with the pattern of data that we see. Whereas explanations, the first two explanations I pointed to, really don't fit at all with the pattern in the data. So if we're thinking about the democratic piece and trying to explain what's going on, explanations 3 and 4 are a better place to start than explanations 1 or 2. And often we're doing this, right? We look at this pattern, and whether we buy the democratic piece argument or not, the pattern is pretty striking. And so if we don't buy the democratic piece argument, we want to think about, well, then what explains this pattern? And this is the kind of thing we want to confront. And we'll talk a little bit more about the pattern of data in our coming segment.